What could cause a man to murder the people who cared for him and loved him the most? This is the story of Christian Longo. Welcome to Viral Crimes. Subscribe and hit the bell icon for more stories. Longo, who grew up in Ypsilanti Township, Michigan, said he had a good childhood. He grew up in his church and was trained to perform door-to-door ministry. He married Mary Jane Baker, a woman 7 years his senior, at the age of 19, after meeting her in the parking lot of his church. Longo had money issues before the wedding when he purchased Baker a 3.5-carat diamond ring on a payment plan. He couldn't afford both rent and a ring 1 month, so he stole $108 from his employer at a camera store. When asked about the missing funds, Longo remained silent. The next morning, he said, "Here is signed and placed a check for the stolen cash on the counter." That month's rent was late. In response, Longo's roommates contacted the congregation leaders and he was sanctioned, losing part of his responsibilities. Mary Jane stayed by him, but the sanctions prevented them from marrying in the Kingdom Hall. Longo said he was sorry and had learned his lesson. "I was determined that I would never do anything along those lines again, anything that was not only illegal, but immoral, unsavory." But Longo's apparent addiction to new automobiles, good clothes, and exotic holidays drained his credit long before Zachary, their first child, was born. Mary Jane Longo quit her job to care for the newborn and 2 more children arrived within 2 years. Despite the joy of the children, the couple's finances deteriorated. The pride kept Longo from asking for help from his parents. He started a construction cleanup subcontracting firm. Despite a fast start, the company eventually went into debt due to rapid expansion. Although the Longo family's credit cards were tapped out and no money was coming in, Longo overstated his company's success to keep up appearances, so successfully that even his own dad invested tens of thousands of his own money with the company. Longo was soon showing off a yacht and 2 jet skis he'd won in a contest, as well as 2 cars he'd purchased. The Longo's financial problems, however, were far from ended. Longo claims he was awoken one morning by the sound of a tow truck in his driveway, repossessing his vehicle. The Longo marriage was also in trouble. In May 2000, Mary Jane Longo phoned her sister to report her husband's emails to another woman. When she questioned him about them, he allegedly said she wasn't fun anymore and he didn't love her. Still, Mary Jane Longo stayed with her husband. Longo's was cash-strapped once again, therefore, he cashed fake checks from firms owing him money. The firms called the cops and Longo appeared in court. He pleaded guilty and got 3 years probation, but because he overstated his income to keep up appearances, he was compelled to pay restitution considerably beyond his means. After elders in the church heard about Longo's check frauds in a newspaper, he was banned. Longo promised his wife that he would be honest and they'd sort out their money. With their finances in disarray and their credit exhausted, Longo got a credit card in his father's name and he racked up about $100,000. Christian Longo thought it was time to start over, with friends and members of the congregation worried about Mary Jane dropping by and creditors continuously phoning. Despite the fact that moving out of state would break Christian's probation, the Longos packed their belongings and relocated from Michigan to a warehouse in Toledo, Ohio. Longo lied to his wife, claiming that they already paid then rent for 6 months, but in the meantime, he was cashing more fraudulent checks to stay afloat. Mary Jane Longo lost contact with her family after the relocation. Sally Clark, her sister, tracked them down by heading to Toledo, canvassing the neighborhood, and spotted their dog outside of the property. Mary Jane declined to leave her husband and returned to Michigan, according to Clark, who chatted with her to make sure everything was okay. When cops discovered stolen equipment he was trying to sell, Longo became agitated. Longo had already gathered up his family and moved before he could be prosecuted with collecting stolen construction materials and passing bad checks. Mary Jane and her spouse were essentially fleeing the law in their stolen SUV and Penske moving truck. Mary Jane, he claims, was unaware of the problem. They kept traveling, camping and staying at cheap motels. They later sold Mary Jane's wedding ring. Mary Jane's relatives had already reported her missing. The Longos finally rented a tiny vacation cottage in Waldport, Oregon. Unfortunately, he got behind on payments and was refused a reprieve. To pay for a stay at a Newport, Oregon, motor inn, he pawned some stolen crab rings. Longo persuaded the manager of a neighboring bay-front condo building that he was a telecommunications company worker waiting for a payment, and they progressed upward. The management believed his explanation, and the Longos were able to move into the $1,500 per month condominium with no cash down. Longo got a part-time work at a Fred Meyer variety store's Starbucks counter. He told his supervisor and coworkers that he supported himself through a prosperous online business, however took the part-time employment because he enjoyed Starbucks coffee. The family struggled and ran out of money just days after receiving their wages. The condo's rent was not paid and food was limited. Longo claims he was compelled to fill up his tank and drive away without paying. Longo recalled standing on the balcony of his condominium with his family asleep inside, staring out over the dark bay, in a police interview after his arrest. He knew they'd have to abandon the condominium soon, but he hadn't told his wife yet. On December 16, 2001, Longo would subsequently refer to this night as the beginning of the end. A guy in an RV park reported a terrible discovery, the body of a tiny boy lying face down in the river near his property, to police on December 19, 2001. The photo of the youngster, which had been artificially enhanced, was soon distributed to the media. The toddler in the picture appeared like 4-year-old Zachary Longo, according to a couple who sometimes babysat the children. 3 days later, divers searching the shallow wetland where Zach was located uncovered the remains of a tiny girl, dragged down by a boulder tied to her ankle in a pillowcase. Both kids were dressed only in their undies. Divers assigned to explore local waterways on December 27 discovered 2 suitcases under a deck at a harbor near the condo building in which the Longo family was residing in the following days. Madison's little body was in one, along with 2 other people, some clothing, and a dumbbell. Wisps of hair protruded from the other, revealing Mary Jane Longo's bare remains. The 4 victims had likely died of suffocation, according to autopsies, while Mary Jane Longo's face bore traces of blunt force trauma. There was also some proof that Zachary and Sadie drowned, however this was disputed. Christian Longo was initially sought as a witness. On December 28, the missing Longo was charged with their murder. His parents helped America's Most Wanted, and he was on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list. Officials found Longo in a Mexican cabana with a German photographer who introduced himself as Michael Finkel, a former New York Times travel writer. On January 13, 2002, Longo was apprehended by Mexican federales and the FBI. After his arrest, Longo recalled his family's final days, but did not offer a confession. After December 16, Longo said he tried to distract himself by watching a movie, going to the gym, and telling coworkers that his wife had left him for another guy. His charms and conversational skills allegedly enabled him get away with several frauds and crimes. When the trial started, Christian Longo was his own key witness. He gave his version of events that led to his wife and children's deaths. He stated that Mary Jane informed him that things seemed to be going well for the family, but questioned him about a lie she suspected he was telling. After the discussion, Longo said he debated telling his wife. He got home from work on December 16 and sat down with some wine and cheese to reflect on their circumstances. Longo went to sleep but couldn't sleep. When Mary Jane knew something was wrong, he began to reveal many things. Mary Jane grew distraught during an all-night talk, he said. Mary Jane got upset when he told her their family van was taken and their condo was unpaid for, he testified. She hit him and assured him she would never trust him again, according to Longo. Longo stated he left her inside the room and went to sleep on the sofa. Longo claimed that on the morning of December 17, he begged his wife to allow him to take off work and promised to look after the kids so she could have some alone time. He testified that she yelled at him that he needed to get to work and that she finally drove him there. Longo stated that he kissed his kids goodbye. Madison reached up to give her Scooby-Doo toy a kiss before he got out of the vehicle and headed to work. Mary Jane was waiting for him in the parking lot when his shift ended, dressed in nothing but a robe and barefoot, as was customary. He stated that the kids were not with her. On the way home, she refused to speak to him. He added that when the pair arrived at their home, he discovered Madison dead on the bed and then tried to reason with his delirious wife. She told him, "You did this, you killed us," and told him the other 2 children were in the water. Longo claimed he lost all control at that point, wrapping his hands around his wife's throat, dropping her, picking her up, repositioning his hands, and squeezing her until he could no longer hold her up. Longo stated that once Mary Jane died, he planned to dump the body in 2 huge luggage. However, when he went to check on his baby daughter, he discovered that she was still alive. Even though she was breathing at the time, he testified, "I thought of her as dead at that point, so he began smothering Madison." He came to a halt when he noticed her breathing again and grabbed her throat. He stated he believed the enormous luggage was too large for her small body. To make it even more comfy, he stuffed it with her garments. The suitcases were thrown into the water behind the building. Longo's comprehensive story astounded the courtroom, but prosecutors would eventually try to disprove it. They pointed out that Mary Jane had no history of aggression or even a nasty temper, and that at 110 pounds, she would be physically incapable of throwing her children into the river with big boulders attached. Christian Longo, according to the prosecution, was a murderous sociopath who apparently determined that his wife and children were too much of a responsibility for him to bear. According to prosecutors, there is evidence that Longo plotted the murders months ahead of time. Investigators discovered data from a webpage Hitman Online, which provides guidance on murder methods, on his computer. They also discovered obituaries with private details written in the corners, hinting that Longo was preparing to change his identity. Longo reportedly secluded Mary Jane from her relatives, according to them, including sending cards from her to her sister in another state to create a false trail. Prosecutors stated that Longo's own words also caught him off guard. Agent Dan Clegg claimed Longo informed him, "I sent them to a better place," despite his refusal to explain how the fatalities occurred with authorities. Longo was condemned to death for all 4 murders on April 16, 2003, after a 6-hour jury deliberation. Several jurors stated that anyone with Longo's intellect and communication skills would be a danger in any setting, not a victim, and that they had no choice but to sentence him to death. What Christian Longo did to his wife and kids was horrific. Our condolences to the friends and family of the victims.